Let's take just a minute to introduce our panelists.
Yeah, I'm Joe Evie. I'm with Bickford Senior Living. We're a Midwest operator based in Kansas City. We operate 63 communities in the upper Midwest into the East Coast.
I'm Tom Wellner, President and CEO of Revera. We are an owner, investor, and operator in senior living space. We have about 500 communities and support about 50,000 seniors across the network in Canada, the U.S., and the U.K. And today we're really focused on our relationship with our capital partner, Welltower.
Good morning, everyone. Naveed Hakim, CFO for Plum Healthcare Group. We own and operate 65 skilled nursing facilities, mainly on the West Coast.
Good morning. I'm Brian Hakler. I'm with KeyBank Real Estate Capital, part of the healthcare group that is focused exclusively on seniors housing and skilled nursing. We provide capital solutions to the industry across a broad platform, and we have about $3.8 billion of commitments to seniors housing.
Good morning. I'm Mercedes Kerr, and I'm Executive Vice President in Business and Relationship Management for Welltower. And we own roughly 1,400 properties in the U.S., Canada, in the U.K., and a large number of operating platforms as well in those countries, focused primarily in seniors housing, but also with a strong concentration in outpatient medical.
I'm Eric Mendelson. I'm CEO of National Health Investors REIT. We're based outside of Nashville, Tennessee. We have over 200 properties, and we're focused primarily on small and regional operators in senior housing and skilled nursing.
Good morning. Michael Schoenbrunn, founder and CEO of Balfour Senior Living, a regional operator owner based primarily in Colorado. We have 8 communities.
I think as we get started here, just to introduce the topic before us, I think we'd all agree that seniors housing and the post-acute space across the United States is evolving and it's maturing. And that's driven by a number of different factors. Among others, there's a dramatic evolution going on in the healthcare system across the country, which affects our business and how we go about doing things. All of us are facing a variety of workforce challenges or opportunities. That's how do we better recruit, retain, train our folks, and then at the same time, how do we make sure that our workforce is staffed most efficiently and effectively, while at the same time reducing the administrative burdens that we put on those folks so that they can do what's most important for our business, which is to serve and interface and be closer to our customers. I think we would also all agree that the way consumers are starting their journey and the way they're interfacing with us, how we market, is changing dramatically. We all know that roughly 60% of folks begin their interfacing with seniors housing today off of the internet, dramatically different than what we would have seen even 4 or 5 years ago. And at the same time, our customers, our residents and their family members, their demands of us and their expectations of what we do, that's evolving and it's changing. They're expecting more real-time information, better connectivity. Even if mom happens to live 500 miles away from an adult child care influencer, they want to learn about what mom's doing more rapidly and quickly and in a real-time way so that there's more interfacing and a better customer service profile that comes from that. Now, all of that requires us to find ways to invest in our operating systems, our technology, the infrastructure that's used for how we operate our businesses, and that requires investment. It requires investments in terms of time, in terms of energy, and in terms of money. And for us at Brookdale, that's not the easiest thing to do, to figure out how do we prioritize those investments, how do we benchmark them, how do we figure out what the return on investment on those type of investments are, some of which requires real judgment on top of the dollars and cents and the mathematics that we all try to do in order to justify these investments. So it's really exciting for me this morning to have our operating partners up here along with their capital partners to think through how they've grappled with some real-life solutions to these investments and these changes and these modifications that need to be made to make their business better. So I think it's very exciting for all of us to get some real-life examples of how folks have struggled with these challenges. And I think I'll start with turning to Tom and Mercedes, who have done a number of different projects, operating improvement type of projects together, and it would be interesting to hear what you all have been working on and how you funded it.
Sure. I'll start.
Please do.
Yeah, we work. I fundamentally believe that you can never run a perfect business, so you always need to look for ways to enhance what we do. And again, we have a broad relationship with Welltower, and so for us, one of the areas in our operating business, so as an operator in Canada with our joint venture with Welltower, we have close to 100 communities where we have a joint venture together. One of the things that we started to look at, and Andy, you alluded to it up front, is labor and making sure that we get the frontline staff at the right spot at the right time. And for us, it started out, the partnership, really as a staffing project where we had support from our capital provider who provided resource as well as perspective on benchmarks and things, and we were open to having an audit of a number of sites and the way we do things and staff. And what we found was simply we had, of our 100 communities, we had a whole bunch that were above the curve in too many hours being spent, and a number that were well below the curve. And then you relate that to how much you're able to charge and or provide billing, and it was not optimal. And so what started as a care provision project is actually over time now evolved into a full sort of standard operating model project where we've taken that learning and we basically applied a map of how the workflow operates within the care unit. Then we applied standards that our resource from Welltower helped us with. We then applied standard hours. We locked it in, measured how it was happening, and then got the staff together. We went through a process of about 8 different steps, listened to feedback, adjusted, then we locked it in, and basically now have a sustaining phase. And we're basically executing that. We're about halfway through the 90 communities, and we'll be finished by the end of the year. And we do it on an 8-week cycle. And basically for us, the return on investment is significant. It will also, I think, impact not just the mathematics and the economic return, but it also, we found, it engages our staff if you do it the right way. Culturally, trying to engage your frontline staff, very important. So those are things that we look for as well. And then we've tried to make it as innovative as possible using a variety of techniques to map it out. So generally speaking, that's one of the areas that we've worked with Welltower.
And Tom, what I would add is Welltower as a partner to Revera is helping in a number of different ways, and we can give a couple of other examples in a minute. But to first stick with the example that Tom was describing, there are times that we might actually help. There's an economic impact to the help, certainly for them, but at cost to the capital partner. That is not necessarily in the shape of an investment per se in the asset, but rather in the form of a resource that is proprietary to Welltower, which we have put to the service of Revera for a number of weeks. There's also the data that we have back at Welltower that allows us to perform the benchmarking, that allows us to identify the areas of opportunity to provide better care at a better cost and to be more efficient in how we're approaching our service. And so this is an example of where we provide, like I said, data in our own proprietary resources, essentially people, our team, to be deployed, and then also able to compare to, Revera is probably the 8th or so of these types of projects that we have performed with different operators, so that we also have that ability to compare and contrast across the various operating platforms. But then there are other ways where we also collaborate, where it is more of a capital investment type of example. And I would give you, in that category, for example, LED retrofits. Again, at this point, we probably have almost 200 properties that we have gone through this process. Revera is actively involved in that today. That's an area where we are actually investing dollars in the retrofit. We've also, I guess we have the contract, if you will, overall for the entire Welltower platform that is a little bit more efficient if we were instead tried to do this one operator at a time. So we've negotiated the contract with the service provider that is actually performing the LED retrofit. The return varies. The cost also varies naturally depending on the size of the community or so. But if I were to give you ballpark figures, I'd say maybe somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000 per property. The return tends to be incredibly generous, and it's in the form of, I know you asked about how do we calculate our return on investment. In that particular example, I think we can calculate it not only in the form of equipment or materials, and that is how fewer light bulbs, I suppose, we have to change given the longer duration of the LED light bulbs, but then also in terms of staffing hours. You might be surprised to hear how much time is actually spent just going through the communities on a regular basis and changing as many light bulbs as we all know we might have. And so there's an element of efficiency there as well. In our estimation, we get our return on our investment probably in 2 years. Maybe if the project is larger, it might be a little bit longer. There are a lot of tax-type benefits and so on that can be also that can help the returns there. So you know, it's a project that feels very simple. Why wouldn't we go ahead and do this? And we have a number of different operators also signed up to that.
Tom, when you all, I know at Brookdale we have a similar program like that, and we try very hard to be careful. There's an efficiency element to these investments, but the fact of the matter is these are quality improvement programs that we think about it. Do you want to remark on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think on the two examples, one with respect to care provision, whether it's we do that. When I have a discussion with the frontline staff, and in Canada we tend to have more unionized employment base than in U.S. healthcare. You'll have the dialogue, and it's always about, oh, we don't have enough hours, or we're stretched, and we can't provide the service, so we need to pile more bodies on the issue, so to speak. This type of an approach actually allows us to look at efficiencies in workflow. It provides benchmarking data from, as Mercedes highlighted, and that's a great dialogue to have with the frontline staff because it gives them perspective. It also challenges the frontline staff to kind of look at how we've always been doing things, and we're really focused on the cultural enhancement of how we run our business. So I think it helps certainly on that side of things, in addition to the economic returns.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And then things like the lighting, beyond the economic payback, if you look at it from the lens of the resident, getting the right lighting, the right spot, the right time to guide residents who may have acuity issues or whatever, we found also has an impact on reduction in falls and reduction in some of the other impacts that might be there. So it's also good.
Yeah. Lots of opportunities, too, to get residents engaged with sustainability efforts and part of the program. Well, Joe, you and Eric have a long-standing relationship that's mutually beneficial to your two companies, and I think you've been doing some technological investments as well.
Kind of afraid to say the wrong thing because I'll get a thump on the back of the head here with Eric sitting behind me. Try and keep it correct.
Or a kick.
Yeah. So, no, we've been in the business a long time. The first resident was my grandmother, and so we've kind of evolved with the business over time. And I think what we found we've made good deals and made mistakes in some. And And so I think working with NHI has been a great experience for us, because what we've done is we've just kind of outlined our whole capital structure and some of the issues that we have. And Eric and his team have been really creative to help us on the other side of the business, which is optimize our cash flow so that we can invest in different things that we know our business needs. And I think what we found in our business over time is when we first got started, the role of an executive director was different than what it is now, and it's a lot more complicated. There's a lot more requirements that we put upon them. You addressed that in your intro. And they just get to the point to where they're working mostly for us, and that they have a caregiver's heart, and they're in a nurturing heart. And if they're working as an administrator and answering our questions and doing our job, they're not doing what they want to do, which is be with the residents. And so what we've tried to do is create, if you look at their computer screens, they have, 10 or 15 different programs that they have to figure out how to manage, right? And so they have to remember the passwords, and they have to remember how to run those programs, how to pull the reports that we want out of the programs to report back to us. So what we decided to do is to say, forget it. We're just going to develop our own technology solution for our executive directors and our nurses and our activities coordinators and things like that, to where it's just one login form. It handles everything that they need to do, from a CRM system to a care system. It tracks our customer satisfaction results on a monthly basis based on the entry, so we're tracking those constantly. And what it does is we try to create the system that's in our language, it's in our culture, it's in our rhythm of how we operate our business. And so when there's a weekly marketing meeting, they don't have to go pull any reports for the weekly marketing meeting. The weekly marketing meeting shows up with its own agenda, with its own results, and all they have to do is just pull it off and actually start talking to their teams. And so it's very little time working for us. Ultimately, the goal is, as we continue to develop out the care side of the system, the billing side of the system, that we get down to the task sheets, which is similar to what you're doing, because when you find out, it's all about quality. It's not about efficiency. It's all about quality. And we've been through something similar to that and operate off task sheets. And when you say somebody's sitting being toileted for 45 minutes, you're like, that never happens in my business. It happens in my business, right? And so trying to figure out how to manage that and have that system be able to tell us, so we have balanced schedules, that we have balanced task showering schedules. It ties into their Outlook calendar. So when we say we're going to do another assessment or a service plan update in 90 days, it automatically allows them to see their schedule in advance, so they're not overbooking a vacation or other responsibilities. So it's just a very consistent mode. But we couldn't have done that. We couldn't have done any of that without the help of NHI helping us on the capital side of the business. And so as family, my brother's sitting on the front row here, which I told him he couldn't come, but he did anyway. But as we look as a family trying to figure out this investment, for us, this is where I'll get thumped, but for us it really doesn't matter, because it's all about what does our executive directors need to be able to provide the best quality care, and for our residents to be as extremely happy. So all we measure is top box score. We only care about how many residents give us a 5, right, on a top box score. 62% of our residents give us a 5. And so we want our directors engaged in those families' lives. We want them engaged in those residents' lives and not working for us.
Interesting. Eric, how have you helped on that?
Well, so I'll direct my comments first to the Bickford organization, and then second to our client base in general. It's interesting coming from an operating background to now be on the capital side, looking at operations from this perspective. And at NHI, one of the value adds we try and bring is sharing that perspective and possibly helping with capital stack issues or debt issues or planning issues. And we can come in and lay out a plan, as we did with the Bickford organization, that resolved a lot of issues, cleaned up cash flow opportunities, made them available, and then that in turn made them a stronger organization that allowed them to invest in operations and make their culture that much stronger by having happy employees, happy residents, the right tools for the job to keep everyone where they needed to be and focused. So we're very proud of that work. And it's not easy to do that analysis and then sell it to somebody. There's a very much a pride of ownership in many cases, and you have to kind of navigate around that. Generally, in terms of investing in operations, NHI is a big fan of stealth investments. I know with the hurricanes, on the top of mind for everyone now is backup generators. And that's a good example of a stealth investment that a REIT like ours would be supportive of, whereby it's not necessarily something that the residents see or think about every day, but when you need it, it's there. It could be a marketing opportunity. Yes, we have a backup generator, and the competition doesn't.
We do.
Yes.
Just to be clear.
I'm sure everyone on this stage has backup generators in every building. And other things like key tax or roofs. As a REIT, right, we're a creature of the tax code, and we want to be able to depreciate investments. We don't want to buy curtains or carpet or paint or landscape. We would rather that the operators spend that money that they're not spending on backup generators or roofs on enhancements to their operations. So we're freeing up that money so they can improve their operations and put their best face forward when they're out there competing against their brethren.
What about, Eric, investments for your operators' sake and their customers' investments in Wi-Fi technology? A number of these communities, 15 years ago, don't have Wi-Fi. Have you all been investing in that way too?
We have, and I'd say we've crested the wave on that the majority of buildings now do have Wi-Fi. And I'm sure you can remember back in the day, it took forever to wire a building, and now even the Wi-Fi systems are wireless, and they don't necessarily need to be tethered to a wire because of the repeaters.
Yeah.
So it's a lot easier to outfit a building nowadays than it was 10 years ago.
I totally agree with that. It's also remarkable how many of our residents want to watch Netflix, and that pipe needs to be bigger than we thought in order to satisfy them. Naveed, you're in the post-acute space. First off, I'm glad to see you all coordinated socks this morning. Well, you do too. You've made some data investments and some operating improvement investments as well. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so really what we're doing is we're investing behind 3 key initiatives. And similar to what Joe said, these initiatives are really focused on how do we free up the data in our organization to improve decision-making and speed so that we can free up our clinicians to spend more time with the patients. So those are the key barometers that we look at to prioritize our investments. We fund these investments through operating cash flow and through the credit line that KeyBank and Brian have really helped us put together, without which these investments wouldn't be possible. And the 3 initiatives that we're currently investing behind today, one is system interoperability. It's how do we break down the silos between our different departments and the data systems in those departments. And also, how do we break down the silos between our business and the hospital systems and the home health business? So within the right rules and regulations, we have a freer flow of data and transparency to provide better care. And also, by creating that common ecosystem, how do we then do care planning at a much higher, more strategic level to really impact the customer in a positive way? The other initiative that we're investing behind is really the digital maturity behind the business. And we're not talking about digital transformation, but really the maturity on how you deploy data and analytics. We're not releasing databases and burying our clinicians with data reports that they have to mine through. Sometimes doing that is just as bad as not providing any data at all. But really for us is how do we bring technology and information to bear to convert that data into actionable insights that not only corporate can use, but more importantly, that can be put in the hands of the clinicians so that they can easily assess what's happening and make a decision on patient care. And finally, the third area we continue to invest behind is clinical care. It's an area that Plum has done very well in, and as we move to a higher acuity, higher demand managed care world, It's an area that we really want to invest behind to make sure that we bring that same level of care to that higher pace environment. In all these cases, we're really not starting with technology and data first. We're starting with business process design. And our goal is to put that in place, and where the data and the technology is available to enhance that process, then bring that to bear and integrate that into the process so it's a seamless way of operating instead of a clunky system that someone has to go outside and use and then come back into the process. In terms of the ROI, how we look at that, there's various ways. You have short-term indicators, what's happening to your occupancy, patient satisfaction, rehospitalization rates. There's some benefits that we look at. I mean, whoever thought that in skilled nursing you'd be talking about R&D credits, but here we are investing behind technology that can drive that. In the midterm, we're really looking to see how that frees up our clinicians to spend more time on patient care, because they're spending less time on administrative activities, which are hopefully going to get more automated. And then finally, over the long term, it's really going to be how those sort of investments drive strategic differentiation and stronger partnerships with healthcare systems in the organization.
And then Brian, how have you all thought about your partnership and how you've helped in that?
Yeah, first, maybe just a couple of general comments, because as a lender, our perspective is a little bit different than the REITs. Our risk tolerance and profile is different. Our timelines are a little bit different. So, just generally speaking, as we kind of look at the seniors housing, skilled nursing space, the real estate's important, the financial sponsorship's important, but we really focus on the operators and their experience and their track record and their access to capital. Because the conversations, yes, we want the historical financials, we want your pro formas, but the conversations today around providing capital, sizing loans, and structuring the loans to accommodate the business needs is far different. We're having these kinds of conversations around investments in technologies and business processes and how those drive outcomes, particularly in the post-acute space. We all look back, several years ago when the Affordable Care Act came, and it was what's going to happen. We knew there was going to be impact. Nobody quite knew when and how. And now it's showing up in the business. And these investments that all the folks on this stage are talking about are extremely important. And so as a lender, we have to sit down, have those conversations, and really understand, what's the impact of these investments? How significant are they? The timing? When does that look like that's going to flow back into your operating results? Because we have to underwrite to existing cash flow and future cash flow. So we're, a little bit constrained in how we provide that capital, but understanding those dynamics enable us to kind of be able to put the support behind it.
Interesting. Michael, I think you have some observations just on the structure of the relationship between capital providers and operators.
Yes, I do. I'm a little bit alone up here because I don't have a partner behind me.
Neither do I.
And I'm going to speak a little bit from the perspective of what I guess I'd characterize as a small operating and owning company that has aspirations to grow, but right now has several different equity partnerships with capital sources, different lending relationships. And it basically comes from a conclusion that the investments needing in operations, I should say, for companies like ours are challenging. And it starts with a premise that I think everyone on the panel will agree with, and I'm assuming everyone, excuse me, in the audience as well, that operations are key, that you can have a beautiful building, well-equipped, latest technology, and if you don't have folks to operate that building, excuse me, from the executive director level down. Is there water or something I can? Thank you.
Sure.
that if you don't have the operating talent, that beautiful building, well situated, well equipped, isn't going to prosper. Secondly, operations is challenging. We've already heard comments about keeping the residents happy, the families happy, and at a time when there is both a growing supply of senior housing throughout the country, we've all seen those charts of new projects coming out of the ground, I think there's a challenge in where does one find the talent to run these buildings. The senior housing industry per se is relatively young. The skilled nursing and hospital environments are not necessarily bringing the same kind of hospitality talents that we need to run a senior housing, independent living, and assisted living community. And conversely, the hotel world, which on first glance looks like it might be a ripe recruiting area, tends to attract people who don't understand and don't necessarily have the empathy to deal with the needs of our residents and their families, who in the hotel world, you're not just serving 80-year-olds. And then when you add in the regulatory requirements in an assisted living and memory care environment, the needs are even greater. So it's a challenge where you find these people, and that leads me to believing that the industry as a whole needs to do a better job than it has in the past in training. And then you get to the question, and investing in training, which is there enough recognition among capital partners that what the operator brings to them as a budget should have a very ample training program, sending people off for skills that they may not have in recruiting that. Is the typical management fee that operators get, the 4 to 5%, sufficient to cover all of those costs, or is the operator supposed to bear that burden themselves, recognizing it's coming directly out of the bottom line? And then, of course, related to that is the fact that most management contracts, I'm not now speaking about relationships with REITs, but rather with private equity groups, or for that matter, the country club kind of funds. Is it a long enough term contract that a private equity group would say, go ahead and spend all that money on training and skill development if the contract itself is cancelable as soon as we exit that property? So our challenge, I think, as an industry is to appreciate that good operations matter, that there are some disincentives for making those investments right now, which ought to be recognized and dealt with. And I look at the hotel world, which has been around much longer than the senior housing world, and see hotel companies, certainly successful ones, that have longer non-cancelable contracts or contracts that may have a payout if they're terminated before a certain end, and a level of compensation that's above the standard senior housing level, so that there's the ability for the management company to be in making that investment. So I'm really here making a plea for recognition that management matters and ought to be paid for, and that it's tough. And without that, as the boomers arrive and as more buildings get up, we as an industry, we're going to have a real challenge in finding the leaders to run those programs, because they're the individual executive directors and their senior managers. However strong the corporate office is, it's still really a decentralized business in many ways, and the judgment of those people on the ground facing the residents and the families are what's most important for the success.
I totally agree with that. Let me give you a capital partner for theoretically for just a second or two. And Mercedes or Eric, do you guys have input on how you think about having training costs allocated back when you have managed relationships as a REIT?
We love to see investment in culture. So, for example, the Bickford organization actually has a training book, and is it every week Every day, they have a stand-up meeting and read from that training manual and impart a lesson about customer care, customer satisfaction, other matters of operations and training, and you really get a sense when you're in a Bickford building that the people are invested in that book and that way of managing and that way of operating a building that is geared towards resident satisfaction, safety, and health. And we love to see that. In terms of direct investment as a REIT and not as a REIT that owns properties and hires managers, we don't have a direct way to invest in that other than to support it and cheer from the sidelines that we agree that's an appropriate investment of time and capital.
Welltower actually has made some direct investments, and to give you just a couple of examples, we support a training module that happens every year at Cornell University. That is for a more executive level, if you will, of management. We actually help organize it and also help to fund the program. We do the same with a certificate program that USC has at their School of Gerontology. So we sponsor the event. We bring traditionally speakers as well. This is more at the care-giving level, and there are professors from the business school as well as the School of Gerontology who participate. We're very involved in other ways with that program as well. We might have talked about before, some of you might be familiar with some of the work that we do in what we call the Welltower Collaborative, and that is when we bring the CEOs of a lot of our operating platforms. When I talk about our operating platforms, what I mean that these are traditionally those investments where we also are participating in the operating business within. We're part of the tenant, if you will, and often in co-investment with the operating manager, the manager, who's also our partner. So in those kinds of events, we actually fund on an annual basis a labor study where we try to bring forth information that might be more standardizing and just helpful to our operating partners in the form of retention trends, what others are doing with respect to staffing, or hiring, technology that might be applicable. In some cases, it includes also information about training modules. So there are different ways where we're putting not only our money but also our time toward those kinds of efforts.
And I would say from the lender's side, this is a very important topic as well. We may not be looking quite as closely at the training budget line item as maybe equity providers, but don't be surprised if your lenders are asking you questions around training and culture and what are you doing to attract and particularly retain employees and make sure that they really give that quality of care and they're vested in their business, in your business, and the outcome. So we're making those kinds of assessments as we decide how we want to partner with people and provide capital. So I've been in this business for 11 years now, and I'm asking questions today that I wasn't asking 4, 5, 6 years ago, and I think this is an important topic. And all of your capital providers, no matter where they are on the stack, are going to be interested in what you're doing in this area.
And I couldn't agree more. This is a people serving people business, and the training aspects are tremendously important. We benefit, as Mercedes said, from the view that we can get through the Welltower people assessment or human resources assessment, and it does give us benchmarks, it gives us context, it gives us ability to strive for more. We also do at Riviera a Riviera University, which is really focused around the executive director and orientating around what he or she needs. And then the example that we talked about initially, which was started out as a staffing project, actually has turned into a standard operating model where we're doing it not just for care, but for environmental services, housekeeping, administration, culture, labor relations across 8 categories within the operations of the business, and that involves from the regional operations leadership down through the executive director a tremendous amount of training and coaching and investment that we wouldn't do unless we got support from our capital partner to do it, and the payback is tremendous.
Right. And then, Michael, I think what you're distinguishing is there's a different type of relationship. The Mercedes, Welltower, Rivera relationship intended to be very long-term oriented. And
Exactly.
The relationship that you're talking about is somebody who, I think I hear you, develops a building or has a more short-term duration in mind, and therefore it creates at least the potentiality for a little bit of a disconnect or misalignment in terms of longer-term investments. How do you suggest, how should we think about improving that or conversing with capital partners who, by definition, have a shorter-term relationship? How do you see that conversation going? How do you see that evolve?
I wish I really knew for sure. I do know that there's a short-term conflict between maximizing profits. A private equity group, for instance,
right,
different from a REIT, is typically an investment horizon. Can you still hear me?
But you're down.
Okay.
That needs to come up. Your mic fell. See it right there?
I'll just hold it. There's a short-term conflict between the private equity group that will typically have a 5 to 7 year hold, and for that matter, individual investors who are looking for the greatest return for the length of time, IRR driven as they are, with making investments that they may not be around for over the latter half of that investment period or the longer term. So, I mean, my advocacy would be that the industry finds ways, to sort of repeat a little what I said before, that either operating agreements, assuming certain benchmarks are made, are for a longer term so that the operating company can make those investments rather than see themselves, when there's a transfer of the asset, losing the operating agreement and that money is simply lost, or having some kind of, if not a guarantee for a length of time, more like what the hotel world does. You know, Marriott and Hyatt don't typically own the assets that they have, but they have a 10 or 20 year kind of management contract that allows them to make investments knowing that they're going to have that staff in place for a long time. Right now, that's just not the custom. I would submit that the senior housing industry is really so fixated on the real estate, and of course the REITs with their capital structure, you know, unless it's a Rodeo structure, have a investment only in the real estate, that doesn't serve the benefit of the residents or the management company as much. Longer-term contract, arguably a higher level of reimbursement for, again, this is for the outstanding operating companies, not the ones that are marginal, would allow for, I think, more groups to enter into a straight operating agreement. Right now, the number of really quality management companies nationwide is pretty small. You've got to make those investments in companies like ours, which have investments in their operations. At some point, you know, finds itself in a liquidity fix. They can't always put in the 5% of the equity for the next deal, and yet, you know, that we're interested in doing those other operations. So it takes a mindset change, and you know, arguably, you know, if folks would accept a lower return, that could achieve making more investments in the operations. But it's tricky, and I think, you know, internal universities are great, but, you know, not all the resources and the best thinking in senior housing is coming out of individual companies. You know, university settings, training programs that may, in fact, cost money to send somebody off for a month at an MBA program or a residence thing, are all things that could benefit the industry and It would be nice if, the operating company isn't the only one bearing that cost.
Andy,
sorry.
Please, go ahead.
I was going to add something because I think that maybe part of what the conversation is highlighting is that, at least in my opinion, and maybe some of you might agree, there are different types of capital partners that might be more adequate depending on the stage of a life cycle of the company. So that in the early sort of embryonic stages, if you will, of a company, you might benefit from having a particular type of capital partner, whereas on a longer term, when you are now perhaps in a more mature stage of the company, a different type of capital structure might be more fitting. And I think that might address some of what you were just describing. To say it differently, not all capital is created equal. Naturally, everybody has different objectives that are driving their decision making. And so I think that that's something that, not to be too maybe simplistic with my thinking here, but sometimes people think that everybody's dollar is equally as green, and so therefore all money, I'm really only caring about the return, what is my lease rate, if you will, or what is the cost of that capital. I think, in fact, you have to really dig much deeper and understand the objectives of your capital partner. Are you like-minded, which, that is an incredibly important element of our decision making when we're making investments. Are we like-minded? Are we heading in a similar direction? Can we help one another get there?
I think the one piece that I'd like to add to that is, even in a private equity or a term loan horizon, it doesn't take long today, given the volatility and the change and the pace of change in the industry, for buildings that have substandard trained individuals to show that impact in their results. So really the onus is on us to really work with our capital partners to show them the correlation between those buildings that have high trained staff and clinicians and the results that they're generating versus some of our other buildings, and to really push for that investment going forward.
That's really I'm melding Michael's point with yours, or at least attempting to, because what that is to me is a cry for better benchmarking, which proves demonstrable value, which a capital partner can get his or her arms around. And I think as an industry, leaving aside the skilled nursing side a little bit, but just in terms of assisted living and the quality of the outcomes and how we benchmark those data and those sort of things, that to me is a real opportunity for us, both in terms of how we market the business, how we demonstrate in an objective way what it is that all of us do each and every day, but it's also powerful and compelling when our capital partners look at that and recognize, well, we need to make commensurate investments necessary to produce those outcomes. Is that part of what you were getting at?
Yeah. I think you hit on some pretty good points there, Andy. We are looking for that benchmark data to show how that comes into play and where we need to be. In addition to that, though, we're also really looking to show them the correlation between how investments in these training programs in the buildings that they've been deployed in result in better outcomes, not only from a patient, but a financial perspective 18 months, 2 years down the line, which is well within their horizon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have about 10 minutes. Are there questions from the audience? If so, just raise your hand. Yes, sir.
So, Joe, how do you access, or how do you deal with when you talk about your monthly resident evaluation?
Mm-hmm. How do we access it? How do we? Well, it's all in the system. So all the key contact information's in the system, and so then a survey is sent out via electronically through text or email or whatever it might be, whatever the power of attorney's preference is. So we measure the resident side of things. So residents who do want to participate in the program and provide satisfaction results, along with the caregivers, the family caregivers, and so that's just done on a monthly basis, and it kind of is a blast out. We get a pretty good response rate. I mean, every month we'll see how many people will respond back, but generally it's above 60% of the people will respond back of a comment. So you're kind of tracking that. And then we send out a more in-depth detail questionnaire when you start asking about dining service and care and chaplains and things like that. The results are a little bit different, but it's the intention is to have constant communication with our families and our residents, and so if there's issues that they can provide and they can comment on, we see those comments. We're talking to to our teams and how we're addressing that. There's internal weekly meetings with them to track their happiness, which we call our satisfactions or happiness. So, they're tracking those internally, and they're responding to those issues as they come up throughout the year versus one survey that goes out at the beginning of the year or right before a rate increase or whatever it might be. So.
That means as opposed to after.
Yeah, that's right. I never said it after.
Yes, sir.
So yesterday at the boot camp, the audience was surveyed, and the two biggest problems in the industry, according to the audience, were employee turnover and occupancy. And I know when you evaluate an investment like a renovation project, you have to make some assumptions about the increase in average rent or the increase in occupancy. And I'm wondering, when you look at an investment like, or if any of you, when you look at a technology investment or some other investment, you force yourself to make an assumption about how this investment, not counting refurbishing or renovation, but how an operational investment will affect occupancy or average rent or the lower cost from lower employee turnover.
That's a great question. Anybody got?
Yeah, I'll give you at least our perspective, and maybe we stand a little bit separate. I think I started by talking to you about how we have close to 1,400 properties of different classes, but the bulk of that in seniors housing, and we have multiple operating platforms. So we have a tremendous database, and we actually have a data scientist team within Welltower that can create the correlations of data. The data points that we have, if you consider the financial information that we are receiving, the information that we can obtain just from the market. So we actually can make relatively scientific decisions about what we think are going to be the opportunities and the returns that might be associated with an investment, a refurbishment. Can we really impact the market? So we take a fairly detailed approach at all of this. The same is true for some of the other investments that we're making. But like I said, just given our reach, given our size, we might stand somewhat alone in that, or uniquely in the way that we're trying to mine that information to make those decisions.
I was thinking about a non-refurbishment in particular, like putting in Wi-Fi or some other technology investment.
On our end, we do take a look at both of those metrics, and really, if you look at what we're doing with business process redesign, knowing that length of stays are going down, they'll continue to go down as care gets better. Really what we're focused on are investments that will drive increased throughputs and how quickly we can automate certain processes that allow us to bring in patients faster. Also, in terms of the data and analytics that we're looking to bear, we're looking to see what sort of correlations they have with employee turnover, because when we poll those employees during the exit interviews, it's really about them being overwhelmed and just too much work and looking to get into a much more stable place. So by investing behind some of these technologies, that is very much on the forefront of our mind, is how do we improve occupancy and how do we alleviate the pressures on our employees through enabling them to make decisions faster.
I'd say one thing from Brookdale's perspective around these questions. First off, I think there's science, there's mathematics, there's objective criteria that you can look at. There's also, frankly, judgment. And in some cases, there's a defensive nature to these investments as well, too. If you don't make them, you're going to go backwards as opposed to going forward. So we try to do all of that work. And what we do, in fact, we're just in the process of doing it right now. Every year, the list of things we would like to do is, of course, longer than we can afford, either in terms of the amount of investment that's necessary or in terms of the time or the energy that's necessary. So we go through and we try to figure out, okay, we got 15 good ideas, we're going to do 3, and then we're going to figure out how do we pilot or experiment with those programs in a way that can justify the thesis that and we have a bunch of communities, so we can do that. But we try hard to say, okay, here's the bet we're making, here's what we think we're going to get from it, based upon our expected outcomes on a number of different factors. And then we try to test that before we go to full implementation. That would be how we would try to address your question.
Yeah, and I would say we're very similar to how we approach it. We use both an analytical view. We tend to do pilot, test, measure, and then lock into to roll out across a large network. So I think you can get both.
Yeah.
Being a small family business, we're pure judgment.
I want to be you. I think we got time for another question or two. Anybody else have something? Yeah.
You mentioned that in operations, you're not, when you have savings, you don't want to go and put that back into like the curtains or the aesthetics or the flooring, et cetera. And I'm very interested in the sense that you want to invest in tech and staffing, but on the contrary, the point was made that if you've got lighting in the right place and the right time, it not only enhances the resident's experience, but also maybe does something like prevent a fall. And so my question would be, where in the process of analyzing operations savings or potential for operations savings is interior design and aesthetics considered? And then in addition to that, how does that affect recruiting potentially? As you say, you're looking for hospitality grade staff.
I can speak to that. At Balfour, we focus on the upper end. So for us, interior design is very important. I think as you go up the acuity level, it may make less of an issue, but we still think even in skilled nursing, not only the residents, but the family members who are making the selection on behalf or in partnership with the resident will prefer having a more pleasant, arguably residential, if not sort of country club kind of environment, especially if they're going to be there for a long time. I think it also makes a difference in recruiting staff that say, this is a place I'm spending 8 hours a day, and on a moment-by-moment task, there may be challenges dealing with people who are sick and who have issues and are not always the most pleasant, understandably so, that they look around and they feel that that's something that's fun to come to work for, to be in a beautiful environment. So it makes a difference. Does it trump the quality of care? Of course not. Can it be consistent? You know, when you're not getting the operations done, then the gap arguably is more startling and detrimental. If it's a beautiful building and the care stinks, you know, and your rates are that high to furnish repeatedly on a refurbishing basis because things wear out, then the expectations get even higher and you find yourself in tough straits. So I think it does make a difference. Depends, I think, on the level of care and also where your price point is. If you're in the middle, if you're in an area that doesn't, necessarily value, better design, then arguably it may be gratifying you as the owner to walk into a place and say, this is mine, I could live here, but for the market it may not make sense. For us, we're targeted at the higher level, so what we think we would want is what most of our residents want.
I can tell you at NHI, we've seen time and time again that by investing in the design, the interior, and natural light, especially on an older building, you can breathe new life in it. I remember back in the day when I was in operations, we wanted Welltower to allow us to sell a building, and I think Chris Simon said, we looked at the building, there's nothing wrong with the market, there's nothing wrong with the building, you need to do better. And so we paid for a renovation, and wouldn't you know it, it filled up right away, and the energy around a renovation and new design can really put a spring in your marketing department's step. We used to joke that if you were having a bad month, just put up an easel with some sort of design board, any design board, and say, this is coming, and people would respond to that positively. So, I'm very suspicious now when I see design boards.
Well, on that bit of subterfuge, we're out of time. We very much appreciate everybody attending. Please fill out your evaluation forms. We would like your feedback. Thank you very much.